we would all be better served to take a breath and reflect on where other people are coming from instead of just assume everyone is like you, because they're probably not.
Welcome to That Pivotal Moment of Change, the podcast where we dive into the career-defining moments that shape who we become. Success, setbacks, big decisions, we unpack it all. Let's get into it. Today we welcome Peter Merholz.
Hey, Peter, welcome to the podcast. Looking forward to the conversation.
Ryan, I am pleased to be here. Thank you so much.
Awesome. So we are going to jump into it here. So can you talk about your background and how you got into design?
I have to do the edited version or we'll be here for the entire podcast because I got into design. I first became aware of it over 30 years ago when I came across the books The Design of Everyday Things and Information Anxiety at a job I had, and realized that you could be paid to think in the way that I thought. I didn't know what I was going to do. I was young. I was in my early 20s and still figuring out what my future was. And I got a job at a CD-ROM publisher back when that was a viable industry, where I was helping first produce CD-ROMs and then produce their website. And I was working with people with formal design degrees in that context and learning about design. And then when I left that company, my one marketable skill was being able to code the hypertext markup language, aka HTML. And I got a job at a design firm in San Francisco that had been a traditional design firm, identity and graphic design, but had been making the move into digital and web design. That was Studio Archetype. But I was not a designer yet. My first year, I was a web builder. I don't even know what we called the title. But then I took a class in user-centered design and usability engineering. It was a night class that I heard about. I don't even remember how. And that changed my life. Coming out of that class, I told the company I worked for, I want to be an interaction designer. I don't want to do any HTML anymore. And that put me on the path of being a designer. I left that company. I was independent for a while. Then I ran design at a startup called Opinions. And then I left that to start Adaptive Path in about 2001. I kind of fell into it, chasing muses, but no formal training besides that one semester of night classes. But just realizing that how I process the world is there's a way I can get paid to do that, and it was called design.
Very cool. And I love the bit there with CD-ROMs. I got into that early on too, and HTML. I feel like talking to a lot of designers started off down the HTML path and then found their way into design through code.
Basically, if you were, my degree's in anthropology, and there was a group of us in the world who had humanities degrees, but were not afraid of computers. And so we had this, we were willing to teach ourselves things like HTML or Perl or whatever, and we could get jobs. Yeah, that's what it was like in the early 90s.
For me, I started off thinking I was going to be a developer and quickly realized I was a really bad developer. And that's how I found my way into design, just being really bad at something, but interested in how things and why and the problems. I think I was thinking about the other side of it. So what are you up to now at Humanism at Scale?
So Humanism at Scale is the name of my company, though I don't really use it publicly much. But I am a one-person consultancy for the last over 5 years now. I do a range of things. I embed with companies and help them. So my consultancy or my whole practice is around how can I help make design organizations more effective. About 8 or 9 years ago, I co-wrote a book, Org Design for Design Orgs, and that's really been my calling card. And so in my consultancy, I've embedded and helped heads of design evolve their design organizations, either how they recruit and hire, the roles that they have established, their career architectures and career frameworks, and how people grow in those roles. I do a bunch of leadership development, so training and coaching and mentorship for leaders and helping them be better at their job. So that for the last 5 years has been the bulk of my work. I also have a quasi coaching practice that I call Thought Partnership, where I work with heads of design in a very lightweight fashion as to help them in their jobs. I teach and train. I do actually more and more of that of late, honestly, which I love. I love teaching. I always have loved sharing what I have learned and helping others evolve their practices. I get a real thrill out of that. Oh, and I do the podcast. So I co-host a podcast called Finding Our Way, which is about design and design leadership. That's not formally a humanism at scale endeavor. That's just a hobby with my old friend and former colleague, Jesse. But it's definitely related to the work I do.
Nice. And you mentioned your book, Org Design for Design Orgs, before. That's certainly been an influential book in the industry. Was writing a book something that was always on your radar? How did that come to be?
So I've been writing about my work since, you could say, 1995 or 6. It started on mailing lists back when those were viable modes of social media. And I would be on these web design mailing lists and writing what I thought in terms of how web design should work. And I mentioned that design firm that I worked at, Studio Archetype. I used to write like a weekly email internally about kind of the state of the web and related to design. And then when I left, I started my blog, peterme.com, which was meant to kind of carry that on. And that was in 1998. So I've been writing about design for over 25 years. In terms of books, I wrote a chapter in a book in the late 90s about animated GIFs. Then Adaptive Path in 2008, we wrote a book. So my consultancy, there were 4 of us who wrote a book. I wrote a couple of chapters in that book. And then the way that org design came about was in 2014, 2015, I'd been leading design at Groupon. I'd been a VP there. And there were no resources for design executives who were trying to figure out how to establish and grow and build effective teams. There was literally zero out there. And so in the mode that I had been my whole career, I started being reflective about my practice, and I wasn't writing about it. I would be invited to speak at like local meetups, and I would talk about what it means to be a design executive, because I figured that people in the audience would be interested to hear kind of what it's like on the other side. Many of them had design executives in their lives, but might not really understand the role. And as I was talking about my work as a design executive and the challenges I was facing, which were largely organizational, I would just get this feedback from people who were like, no one else is talking about this. Where can I find any more information like what you're sharing? And I didn't have anything to point people to. And around that time, someone I had worked with at Adaptive Path, she had stuck around and then was now part of Capital One. This is Kristen Skinner. She had been a program manager, design program manager that I had worked closely with at Adaptive Path. I left Adaptive Path before it had gotten acquired. She'd stuck around and so had seen Adaptive Path get metabolized by this giant corporation, Capital One, and thus had her perspective on organization design as well. And had some similar experiences in talking about it, receiving this kind of really, I wouldn't even call it positive feedback, just enthusiasm, like the dehydrated person in the desert just searching for water. And so I was in the process of getting laid off, job that I had. The writing was on the wall. And so she and I pulled together an outline, talked to a couple of publishers, ended up with O'Reilly, and in 9 months wrote a book. The impetus was that really kind of overwhelming interest. We knew it would never be a bestseller. We knew that the audience, it wasn't going to hit the kind of target that design of everyday things, or things that, what is it called? Don't Make Me Think, or some of these kind of classic design texts. Like, we weren't broad interest. We were for people who could shape organizations, which meant you're kind of focused on design leaders. But we knew we would have the kind of book that would have what Kevin Kelly called 1,000 true fans, that it's not for everybody, but for the people for whom it is, they will go deep on it. They will obsess over it. And that has proven true. I recently was at a conference and someone showed me a copy of the book that had markups and stickies and tape and all that kind of stuff through it. And we've got that kind of feedback for almost a decade now. So that's how the book came about.
Very cool to hear that and how it all worked out. Fun fact, by the way, I believe that you were the one credited with blog. Is that right?
I can explain that. So I mentioned earlier how when I left Studio Archetype, I wanted to keep writing about design. And so I started a website. At the time, it wasn't even a weblog, because I was going to write, the occasional like longer form post, 500 to 1,000 words or something. But as I was doing that, I kind of kept a collection of links, and I would share those links and they would go in a sidebar. Here's some stuff I found out there. And then over time, the links and the posts swapped places where the main thread was, here's stuff I found. And then occasionally I would write a post. And it turned out there was a word for that kind of link-oriented website, and it was a weblog. It was a word coined by this gentleman, Jorn Barger. He had his own. It was the Robot Wisdom Weblog. And so there was a small community of us who were webloggers, and we linked to one another and enjoyed kind of scouring the internet for interesting stuff. And then at one point, as a lark, in my little sidebar, I said, I'm no longer going to call my website a weblog. I'm going to call it a wee blog. I'm going to shift the syllable one letter over. So instead of being between the B and the L, it'll be between the E and the B. And people dug it. They picked up on it. They would respond. They started calling it a wee blog or a blog. They dropped the WE, and so I kind of ran with that for a little bit. But that would have died on the vine. My hundreds of readers were not going to turn this into anything that anyone else had heard of, except that a few of those readers happened to be at a company called Pyra Labs that was creating a project management tool. But on the side, literally as a weekend hack, a couple of them built something that they ended up calling Blogger, which was a tool to make it easier to write and publish a blog. Kind of like my story, where how my long form got supplanted by my links. Their business, the Blogger, just took over, and this project management tool was backburnered because what people were interested in was this tool called Blogger, which then took off, got acquired by Google. But with the ascent of that tool and this practice of blogging, the word blog carried with it.
It was a very cool story. Okay, we're going to move on here to some reflective questions about you. What are some key lessons you've learned throughout your career?
I'm pausing because it's kind of a big one, but probably the most important thing I've learned throughout my career is most people don't want to be engaged in the way that I want to be engaged. I like active conversation, not quite debate, but like rich, robust dialogue in a way that I have learned many can find daunting, many can find overwhelming, many can find intimidating. Many believe that I am talking at them and that I am hot-headed or dogmatic because of the passion with which I will go forth, which was never my intent. In those spaces, I am wrestling with ideas and like that spar. But probably the single biggest thing I've had to learn as a professional in my life, in my practice as a leader, as a husband, as a friend, is that I need to do some work to better understand where other people are coming from and understand how they are receiving what I am putting out there, and then moderate how I engage so that my intent comes through, right? So that other people will pick up what I'm putting down, as opposed to just getting kind of turned off or fed up or fearful or intimidated. I mean, the kinds of responses that always surprised me, that I would hear about how people received me. And it's ongoing work. Like that work is never done because it's an inclination of mine. It's how I show up. It's when I get excited and I lose those filters and I just start getting spun up. Once I'm in a job, I'm usually like I'm good. People get to know me. They understand kind of, okay, this is how he is, and it's not a problem after a while. But that first impression, uh, if I'm not careful, can be others can feel unwelcome or intimidated. And so that's probably the single most important thing I've had to learn is we all of us have different ways of managing, processing, approaching, thinking of things. And we would all be better served to take a breath and reflect on where other people are coming from instead of just assume everyone is like you, because they're probably not.
I love the honesty and the even self-awareness in that answer. What are some of the bigger challenges you faced in your career, and how did you overcome those challenges?
That what I just shared is definitely part of it. I have to say, and I think, you know, uh, perhaps as a now middle-aged white dude, I haven't had a lot of challenges. I mean, none that have felt unscalable or something. There were times when, Adaptive Path, our cash flow wasn't where it should be. And, we had to hustle to get work. But, I overcame that challenge by hustling or whatever. There's certain challenges like, one of the reasons that I am independent is because, and I think it's related to what I said about the lesson I'm continuing to learn about how I come across. I interview terribly when it comes to looking for jobs. I've tried very hard to like sit on my hands, catch my breath, like to not engage in my impulsive reactions to the questions or the dialogue that I think is being generated. And even when when hiring times were flush, I would find it hard to get a job because of how I came across. And I also, though, ended up taking that as a sign almost from the universe that like maybe my path is a different path instead of like banging my head against this wall and trying to make something happen that just kept not happening. That's when I went independent again. So I'd been independent in my past, and then had jobs through 2018 when I got laid off. This was different than the other time I got laid off when I wrote the book. I know how to pick them. Coming out of that, after spending about 6 months to a year doing projects like contracts, but while looking for work and never like getting the job and getting the feedback that even when I'm trying to be on my bestest behavior, I'm still coming across as domineering or whatever. I'm like, you know what? Maybe if this is how it's going to be, there's probably another path forward. And as I said, people would reach out to me and want to just work. And so I was taking contracts. I wasn't idle. And I'm like, maybe I should just be independent and lean into that. Because of the book I had and some of my experiences at Adaptive Path, I had a bit of an audience. I knew that I could kind of cash in on whatever personal brand I had built. The way I responded to the challenge of not being able to find a job was start my own one-person consultancy, which is, knock wood, gone pretty well these past 5 years.
Being successfully independent isn't something you hear that often.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. It's one of those where like all my friends are kind of, I mean, I have some friends I know who, what I've seen is if you, at least in my network, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but if you make that commitment to independence, it's not like it's going to guarantee success, but it will do more to enable your success. Whereas what I've seen are my friends who are independent, but not doing so well as independents is because they're not all in. They're like, I'm independent, but when the right job comes along, then I'm just going to take that job. And if you're in a job mode, and no shade at all, all of my best clients are employed. When you're in a job mode, like that's a different mindset. than being independent. And that was part of the challenge I had was, I'd be taking on projects, but then I'd have to like looking for work, looking for a job is its own kind of job, right? It can be 10 to 20 hours a week, calls and interviews and all that kind of stuff. And it's not just about time, but it's about energy as well. And the kind of energy you're devoting is actually pretty different when you're looking for a job than when you're looking for and doing contract work. And so I think folks who are trying to like hedge their bets end up undercutting themselves on both. If possible, lean into one or the other and commit, and you'll likely find, or I think you'll be likelier to find success.
It's great advice. Can you share an instance where a setback or failure turned out to be a hidden opportunity?
I mean, the getting laid off twice now. Two of the times I got laid off. So once in 2015, once in 2018. In 2015, getting laid off then was an opportunity to get momentum on writing the book, because I got severance. And so I felt like I could not work for a couple months. And that was remarkable. I mean, as an opportunity and one that I probably wouldn't have been able to embrace if I hadn't gotten laid off, which sucked, right? I hadn't even been at this company for a year. And then again in 2018, getting laid off at a job I really liked. I was actualized in terms of the work I was doing. I was a VP of design for this company, Snag job, which we had rebranded Snag. I had a great team. I was adding value in a lot of different ways, but there were some financial underpinnings that were not working out for the company. And I was part of a small office in Oakland that they just shut down. Most of the people were in Virginia. It wasn't one of those layoffs where I was like exhausted and needed to like take some time. I'm like, I am ready to go. And so I like was pounding pavement, making connections, looking for jobs, looking for interviews, looking for whatever, had a lot of energy. And it was after, repeated experiences being like going far down interview paths and being, the second choice multiple times kind of thing, where I'm like, okay, this sucks. Because I start getting into that mode where I'm starting to think about how am I going to make real change in this organization. Like I try to invest myself. I already don't try it. It's just how I show up. And so I had what I thought of as like my one last interview there, where it was a company that a big American bank was hiring a head of design for an innovation team. And it was just like tailor-made for me because of my work at Adaptive Path. Like I knew I was exactly right for the role. And I didn't get it. All I had were 3 conversations with folks. So they made a decision to hire a person who was going to lead a team of 40 to 50 people after having with each of them 3 like 30 to 40 minute conversations. And I'm like, that's insane. 1, the questions they were asking were irrelevant. 2, there was nowhere near enough time to get signal on whether or not this person was going to be a good leader. The team that you were leading was not involved in the conversation. It was only other executives. Like everything about the hiring process was broken. And I'm like, okay, I want to fix that. I want to fix how companies try to hire senior leaders in design because none of them know how to do it. So that was where I took like lemons and made some lemonade in terms of it gave me that animus to impart to start my business and to try to help other companies with their design orgs, making them more effective, including how they recruit and hire their senior leaders, because most companies do that terribly.
I agree. I think it's not even at senior leaders. I think it's an across the board type of thing. I think one thing a lot of companies don't realize is if you have a bad candidate experience, chances are the employee experience isn't going to hate. And I mean, I've heard a lot of stories from people, whether it's being ghosted, talking to people who don't understand the discipline in which they are being interviewed for. And there's certainly a problem there. So it's very cool to hear you taking that one on and trying to improve or fix?
Yes, it's true up and down a design org. I focus on the senior leaders because self-interest. And the big issue is the hiring managers know nothing about design by and large, right? They're looking to hire their head of design, which means they are not the head of design. They're head of product, head of something else, head of innovation, head of digital. And they are often unwilling to do the work to actually understand design, or think they know it and lack the self-awareness to recognize that they are ignorant about what actually goes into the job.
Yeah, fair point. And I've heard a lot of stories along those lines, I think, over the past year or two. Probably a whole rat hole we could go down on that one. But to move forward, can you recall a moment in your career that significantly influenced your path?
Sure. There's been a few. Honestly, I like to go to the beginning when I mentioned design of everyday things and information anxiety. Like, I didn't know this path was even possible. And then reading those two books, so the design of everyday things, Donald Norman, I don't know if he even addresses software in there. He might very, very lightly. But I think by the time I read it, I knew he had worked at Apple. And so I was able to make a connection that maybe wasn't in the book and be like, oh, there's folks who help you design software so that it makes sense to people. So I mentioned that CD-ROM company. My first job at that CD-ROM company, I was an intern for a little bit. And then when they hired me, I was QA. And I'm not a technical person. QA wasn't me writing scripts. QA was me clicking. I was button mashing, right? Trying to break the kind of the CD-ROMs experience, right? If we click these things in certain orders, can I trigger a bug? Can I, and there's a lot of that, and writing down as I was using it, like things that weren't working. So I would submit bugs, this thing caused the thing to crash. But I would also submit what I didn't have the language for, but what I would now call usability errors. For example, one of our CD-ROMs was very visual, lots of photographs. So it had a magnifying glass that you could use to zoom in, because if you think about in the mid 90s, 640 by 480 or 800 by 600 screens, right? Rich photography, you might actually want to zoom in to look at detail. But it also had a search function that also used a magnifying glass. And both of them were icons. And I'm like, you can't have two icons mean different things. And it confused the designers and the people who were essentially product managers, that I was giving them this feedback, because they're like, well, but it's not a bug. That's how we designed it. I'm like, yeah, but it's a bad design, or it doesn't make sense. Again, I didn't have the language for it, and that was one of those aha moments where I'm like, oh, I'm seeing something in these interfaces that other people aren't seeing. There's something about how I'm approaching it that I'm grokking, what we would now call heuristic heuristic evaluation style issues that are just not apparent to others. And so to read The Design of Everyday Things, to read Information Anxiety, which is basically an early book on information architecture by Richard Salwerman, and to understand, like, there is an opportunity, a professional opportunity, a career opportunity for applying how I think. These folks are demonstrating it. They have careers doing that. So that influenced my path.
That's very cool. That's a big moment right there.
Yeah, I mean, a few others. I won't be as loquacious. I'm trying to think how speaking of paths, how we started Adaptive Path. Like what made me think that I knew how to run a design firm, and I didn't. Adaptive Path, we had 6 other founders, in part because I knew user experience design content. I knew I didn't know how to run a company. So something that influenced my path, I think this is actually the right answer on this front, is industry networking, which I think is actually kind of suffering and struggling right now. But as I was coming up, I would go to meetups, like local meetups we had in San Francisco for, web designers in the late 90s. I was on mailing lists. I would then start going to conferences, and Adaptive Path is pretty much the product of 6, 7 people who met each other going to conferences, South by Southwest and others, right? And so doing the work, putting myself out there, making these connections, meeting people, finding fellow travelers. I mean, that's how I met Jesse James Garrett, who's my podcast partner still to this day, right? And so that experience of networking, not for the sake of business connections or whatever, like I just was passionate about the content and the material. And so I would go to these places where we could talk about it and find other people who shared that passion, right? But putting yourself out there in that way was crucial for me, and was probably the, whatever path I'm now on. That's the origin story.
I think that's great. And you can't overstate the importance of networking. I feel like I didn't start taking networking seriously until I'd say the past 2 or 3 years. And I'm not at the end of my career, but I'm certainly towards the last half of it. And it's just such an important thing to do that I think a lot of people don't really think about, or certainly not think about till it's too late. And it becomes a lot harder to do. You never know what's going to come out of networking. And even to your story right there, I mean, there's a lot of big moments for you that came from meeting other people who you didn't expect.
Right. You just happen to be in the room with them.
What specific skills or mindsets have been crucial in navigating your career twists and turns?
It's funny. I just literally this morning wrote something on LinkedIn about this. So I'll start with it. And the story is, I'm playing Little League. I'm about 11 or 12, and I'm terrible. I've been striking out every at bat for like many games on end. And I'm at bat and strike one, and I'm like, oh shit, here we go again. and I probably stamp my feet or do something, right? I was really bent out of shape, and I'm sure evidently so. And I hear from the stands my mom yell, "Lighten up!" like maybe something like, "Don't be so hard on yourself." And I did. I stepped back. I took a breath. I probably smiled because my mom shouted that at me, and I got a hit. I got a base hit. Like I relaxed. I stopped clenching. I stopped being so wound tight. And something that I have benefited from throughout my entire career is a bit of that lightening up. Not that I don't take the work seriously. I don't take myself seriously, which I think is just death when you start taking yourself too seriously. Definitely don't take myself seriously. And I don't engage in the drama around work. So I mentioned starting Adaptive Path, there were 7 founders. As you can imagine, you got 7 people. There's going to be strange interpersonal dynamics. There's going to be a lot of interpersonal dynamics, including drama, including cliques and people who feel done wrong, treated unfairly, whatever. I carried almost none of that. I was the one who could interact with the other 6 with no trouble, very easily, even though many of them had trouble really kind of interacting with one another. And that continued as we grew. And there's just something about not getting emotionally invested in that kind of drama. Like it's not interesting to me. It's not worth the time. It doesn't seem to lead anywhere positive. And so why do it? Why? It's a little bit of that lighten up, like let go of that. That doesn't matter. I think that mindset has given me a kind of equanimity, an interpersonal equanimity that has served me well throughout my career. In terms of skills, so that's more of a mindset. Just like when I was at Studio Archetype, my first proper kind of design job, though I was a web designer, people would be stressed out because we have to work late. We got a client deadline. I was never stressed. I'm like, I'm going to do my best. It'll either be good enough or not, but all I can control is what I'm able to deliver. And I just didn't understand why folks would get themselves like, yeah, it's just like, that's all any of us can do is our best. That's something I try to teach to my children. In terms of skills, 2 skills. One is writing. I've always been a writer. I continue to be a writer. I think very hard about how I write. I'm very intentional in how I write. And my ability to write is 85% of my success is because I am able to communicate with clarity through language, through words. And that is, I mean, there's a reason that communication skills, written verbal communication skills, is on every job description. If you're going to work on one skill, clear communication is, there's nothing, literally, I can't think of a skill more important than that. But the second skill that served me, and it's kind of a skill slash mindset, is, it's hard to, I don't know what to call it besides something like systems thinking or information architecture. And it's nothing that I ever necessarily consciously developed. Again, I mentioned how when I read like Information Anxiety by Richard Saul Wurman, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that just makes total sense to me. When I first heard about faceted classifications, which when I heard about that, I found out later that library and information scientists thought that faceted classifications were too hard for normal people to understand. So we're only going to show them hierarchical kind of organizations. And I'm like, well, I totally get faceted classification. And so I use that skill. So when we wrote Org Design for Design Orgs, I didn't realize it until after it was published that that's basically an information architecture look at org design. It's a lot of frameworks, it's labeling, it's taxonomies, all for, again, because org design requires that kind of a similar clarity. You don't want to call the roles things that are too similar, right? You don't want to have, one of my clients says UX design and interactive design, and that means something very different in their context. But to anyone looking at it from the outside, they'd be like, how are those possibly different roles? Right? Like, so labels matter. The associated responsibilities for each of these roles matters, and having some clarity there. Like things like skills. I do, I create skills taxonomies for some of my clients, and being very mindful about how do you make them so they're not too granular, right? This is not shade, but if you go to researchskills.net, they have 47 skills. But some of those skills are like a journey map, or, like very granular products. So like what is the right altitude at which to create your skills, that kind of stuff. Anyway, that kind of information architecture systems brain has served me well in handling kind of the complexity of whether it was the digital services that I was helping design, or now the human organizations that I'm helping shape.
That was an incredible answer. I think you just said a lot of things which are phenomenal advice. I really, really appreciate that. Looking back, is there anything you would have done differently in your career?
Yes. I don't know what I could have done about Adaptive Path, but I think it's unfortunate that Adaptive Path lasting impact has been essentially negated. And I'm not, this isn't to cast aspersions at Capital One. The house I live in is somewhat, in response to their acquisition of Adaptive Path, and they were actually an excellent steward for quite a while, but it's not their priority to run a design firm within their giant business, and Adaptive Path was such a contributor to a broader dialogue around design and user experience, and then service design and all this stuff. And it's just all this great thinking that we had published and shared, and the videos from our conferences are just either gone or like scattered to the wind, so out there but really difficult to find. Maria Judice is a friend of mine, or Nate Bolt, and both of them sold their companies to Facebook. That's what it was called at the time, but both of them retained ownership of the brand and their IP. If they were able to kind of carve off certain aspects of it. I wish we had been able to do something more like that, so that the Adaptive Path legacy could live on. And then the other regret-ish I have is at the beginning of 2014. So I was running design at Groupon. My boss, the head of product, left, and that caused me to be exposed to the rest of senior leadership to a greater degree than I had been before, and I was not happy with that. I saw how their efforts were in direct conflict with what my design team was trying to put forward in terms of doing right for the business. And I quit. And this is something that I am more likely to quit than stick around when times are getting tough, because I'm like, I don't need to deal with this. That was a situation that I would have benefited from a bit more resilience, stick-to-itiveness, equanimity, whatever you want to call it. Seeing it through, like the 10 years later, and all this material I've developed for around leadership and leadership development, I wish I had received that 10 years ago, and I probably would have stuck around. I would have figured out how I could make my impact, where I could control, how to kind of wall off the negative influences or mitigate those negative influences, seen stuff through. And I don't know if I could have done anything at Groupon. I mean, its challenges as a company for the last decade are indicative of some of what the challenges were a decade ago. But I could have gotten a bit more traction, stayed there longer than a year and a half. I don't even know if I was there that long, and probably used that as a springboard to other kinds of design leadership opportunities that I just never had access to. That was, 10 years ago was the largest team I've ever led of 60 people. And I was primed to on a continuing ascent. But because I couldn't quite stick it out, and I'm not begrudging my career, particularly in the last 5 years as an independent consultant, and the freedom and flexibility I have, but there is what might have been with that career path if I had just been able to not let my narcissistic CEO get me so down all the time.
That's a good one, but things end up working out.
They do. It's just, paths not taken, right? You wonder. That's the one fork. I've written the book. I wouldn't be doing the kind of consulting I wouldn't have the life I have now. I'd have a different life, but I wonder what that would be like. And I'm like, hey, that looks awesome to, lead a team of 100, 200, 400. I actually think some of that can be exciting and making real impact, and having that kind of both impact on the world through the work of your team, but also on the team, and being able to help shape and enable. So I'm trying to do that in a different way, right? That's why I'm so public in my work and consulting and in teaching, is I want to have a broader impact, and what I hope is a positive impact.
You certainly are making an impact, and a positive one at that.
Well, thank you. I'm not fishing for compliments or anything like that. I just, it's that path just kind of got cut off for me. It's like, well, what path can I make that has some of those qualities, some of that same impact?
What do you think the future of design looks like?
So I think a lot about this. If you listen, for folks who are new to me, check out my podcast, episode 45, The Phase Shift. Jesse and I are kind of grappling with what feels like this discontinuous shift in design within at least kind of corporate contexts, between, from up to about 2022, the beginning of 2023. And we still don't know when this next kind of wave starts. We're still in this strange liminal moment. A lot of folks will answer with AI. I don't think AI is going to be, I think AI might do a lot to relieve us of a lot of production burden. A lot of what's happening in design systems, a lot of what's happening in componentry. I don't think AI is going to meaningfully affect the kind of design that I am more passionate about: service design, higher order design, systems design, design of experiences. So for me, AI, AI is like going, a little bit from like Photoshop to Figma, where, doing stuff in Photoshop just took you longer because there was so much more manual labor involved. And then with Sketch and Figma, like certain things got easier and easier, with the hope then that by making production easier, you can now free up time and your brain for higher order challenges. I think, though, that the role of design in business is still very much in flux. I suspect, and at least within technical and software contexts, I suspect product management and design are going to continue to get blurrier and blurrier. I think we're going to see more and more designers become product managers. I think we're going to see the role of product management embrace more and more of that higher order design and user experience practice. And I think that's okay. I just think like these labels will shift, but the work will be the same. I also think, and this is something I talked about a few weeks on LinkedIn, I had a little video where up until 22, all these companies were just hiring more and more designers. And many of those companies were doing it without having any idea why, except that other companies were doing it. There's a bunch of people out there, a bunch of companies out there that their behavior is driven by what others are doing as opposed to what they think, what they've figured out on their own. And I think what we're seeing over the last couple of years with a lot of the layoffs and a lot of a kind of moving backwards in design maturity in a lot of companies, or perceived design maturity, is that a lot of those companies that were scaling design teams, but only because other people were doing it, are now like, well, that's a waste of money. Like they're finally kind of waking up to like they've just thrown a lot of money away, and they never took design seriously. They were not going to take design seriously. They are not going to take design seriously. Like it's just they're realizing they're not on the design train. And I think we just have to be okay with that a bunch of companies are just going to be design ignorant, or use it primarily as production. And for me personally, I'm trying to make a pledge to focus on those companies that are embracing design. They might not have figured it all out. They're not Apples and Airbnbs or whatever, but they get that there's real value there, a distinct, interesting value there, and that's something that they want to continue to invest in and unpack. And I think we're going to see. So I think the future of design involves an ever increasing chasm between the design haves and the design have-nots when it comes to companies. I think we're just going to see some companies just further and further left behind. And those companies that embrace design become more and more design or experience driven.
Sure. And one more question, then we're going to get into the closing stuff here. What advice would you give to someone earlier in their career who is still trying to figure everything out? And what advice would you give to a senior leader? Could be the same advice.
To the person earlier in their career, that's a tough one. It's so dependent on where you're coming from. Well, so something I said earlier that I think is relevant is be a good writer. Even if you're a designer, even if it's really hard for you to write, put in the work to develop your writing skills, because they will only serve you, whatever context you're in. And apart from that, like I'm trying to think, like would I encourage that early career writer or designer to take a broad view of design, or should they, focus on code and designing code and really not like learn how to build what they're creating? I'm like, I guess my thought for them is follow your muse. Like don't listen too much to whatever the supposed conventional wisdom is early in your career about design, because all we society, industry needs all kinds of design and design work and design effort and design contributions. And so whatever it is that you are inclined to, in the same way that I was inclined to kind of information architectural design problems, whatever it is that you're inclined to, there will be use for it. And so be okay following that muse, and don't get too caught up in, designers must code. If you're not one who's interested in code, you'll be fine. But if you are interested in code, great. Like knock yourself out. So that's for the younger designers. For the design leader, the lesson to be learned, or the thing to communicate is like, at some point, it's not about design anymore. You got to recognize that as a leader, you are going to need to do the person-to-person work of enabling, supporting, advancing your design agenda. You cannot rely on evident quality of the design work to carry the day. That's just not how it works.
Great stuff. So move on here to some closing questions. What is your favorite quote?
Sorry, it's a little bit like the man on the bridge in Monty Python. What is your quest? What is my favorite quote?
You can go with Monty Python. That could work.
I don't have a good one. There's what my mom said about lighten up is the first thing that comes to mind. Because I think it's a broadly applicable general purpose piece of advice that I have never found where it doesn't apply. So I'll stick with that. Lighten up, Julie Merholz.
That works. And there's a lot of great content out there. What are you looking at now that you would recommend? Feel free to push your own stuff, by the way.
Okay. Well, if I'm pushing my own stuff, I have a newsletter, buttondown.com/Peter Merholz, which I use in part to continue to point people to interesting things I find. I'm active on LinkedIn. There's a lot of noise, but if you treat LinkedIn like a social media platform, which it is, and you put in a little effort to train the algorithm, right? So if you're seeing stuff on LinkedIn that you don't like, there's a little button there that you can say less like this or don't show me this and all that kind of stuff, and it will learn. You don't have to just be a victim of the default on the algorithm. And if you train the algorithm, your signal to noise ratio will go up. So LinkedIn, definitely. My podcast, Finding Our Way, we try to do a high signal to noise. Another podcast that I definitely want to promote, which is I think great for designers of all kind of experience levels. You talked about early career, is Brave UX by Brendan Jarvis. He's based out of New Zealand. He is a phenomenal interviewer. For the length of those podcast episodes are just crammed filled with interesting content nuggets, meaningful material. Huge fan of that. I would say, in terms of people to follow, I end up quoting her a bunch. Erica Hall, who is very active on LinkedIn, is an excellent source of content. She brings a very she's been doing it as long as I have, but similar to me, doesn't have a formal design background, and so I think is able to provide a perspective, a needed, fresh perspective on the work we do, that hopefully encourages UX and design people to get over themselves.
Right on. And I think you just covered some of this, but maybe just to recap it all here, where can people find you?
They can find me at petermerholz.com. It's my professional website. I do have a blog there that I update occasionally with kind of my latest thinking around org design and design leadership. I also have a link there to my newsletter, and there's a contact form, and I'm happy to hear from anybody. Or LinkedIn at Peter Merholz. I'm on there multiple times a day, and always happy to engage. People drop me messages with some frequency. And then if you want my non-professional side, the social media that I'm using most now is Blue Sky, and I'm at peterme.com on Blue Sky. You can use your URLs there as your identity. So easy to find on Blue Sky. But I almost never talk about work on Blue Sky. I mostly talk about the NBA, occasionally talk about, take pictures of what I see as I walk around my neighborhood. Dogs, love dogs. I'll talk about dogs a lot. Just work stuff I try to keep to LinkedIn, and the rest of my life I share on Blue Sky.
Peter, thank you so much for being on today. I think this was a great episode. I'm super excited to get this one out there. Really appreciate it.
It was fun. Thank you for the opportunities to reflect, to take stock, and reflect and share. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for today's episode. Let's keep the conversation going. Drop a comment with your thoughts, like this episode if it resonated with you, and share it with someone who might benefit. And don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Thanks for being part of this journey with us. Until next time.